When Truth Becomes Treason. Intro: The Hole in the Airplane. On January 5th, 2024, Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 took off from Portland with 177 people aboard. About 6 minutes later, passengers heard an enormous bang. Oxygen masks dropped, the cockpit door flew open, and part of the cabin wall vanished. Near row 26, passengers could see the night sky through a rectangular hole in the airplane. Seat cushions, phones, and pieces of the interior wall were pulled outside. For several terrifying minutes, the crew didn't know whether anyone had gone with them. Nobody had. The pilot turned back towards Portland and landed safely. 2 days later, investigators found the missing section of the airplane, a door plug, in a schoolteacher's backyard. Then they discovered what had happened. 4 bolts were supposed to keep the plug from sliding upward. None of them had been installed. They weren't cracked, defective, or weakened by some obscure failure of aerospace metallurgy. They just simply weren't there. Boeing workers had opened the plug to repair damaged rivets nearby. The work wasn't properly documented, the team that normally handled the door wasn't present when it was closed, and nobody performed the final inspection that should have caught the missing bolts. The airplane hadn't come apart because humanity didn't understand how doors worked. It nearly came apart because an organization with inspections, audits, quality departments, and reporting systems had become dangerously capable of letting obvious problems pass through all of them. People inside Boeing had been raising concerns about manufacturing and quality for years. That's what makes this much bigger than one airplane. Institutions usually say they value honesty. They create ethics policies, anonymous hotlines, and corporate posters showing models pointing at the word integrity. The enthusiasm often fades when honesty threatens a deadline, a reputation, a budget, or somebody important. At that point, truth gets renamed. It becomes negativity, disloyalty, sabotage, heresy, or treason. The warning doesn't change. What changes is how dangerous the person delivering it suddenly becomes. Chapter 1: The Traitor Who Wasn't. On another January 5th, 129 years earlier, in 1895, thousands of people gathered at the École Militaire in Paris to watch France destroy a traitor. Captain Alfred Dreyfus stood in uniform before rows of soldiers. He was an artillery officer, a graduate of one of France's most prestigious schools, and a member of the general staff. He was also Jewish, at a time when parts of the French press found Jewish conspiracies behind nearly everything except disappointing weather. French intelligence had intercepted a handwritten note offering military secrets to Germany. The handwriting didn't convincingly match Dreyfus, and some of the evidence was secretly shown to the judges without the defense ever seeing it. Still, France needed a scapegoat, and Dreyfus fit the story people already were prepared to believe. An officer tore the insignia from his uniform and snapped his sword in two. The crowd screamed for his death, while Dreyfus shouted that he was innocent and remained loyal to France. He was sent across the Atlantic to Devil's Island, a remote penal colony off the coast of French Guiana. He spent his days in a stone hut surrounded by guards, insects, heat, and ocean. France had found its traitor. Unfortunately, it had found the wrong one. A year later, Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picquart took over French military intelligence. Another intercepted message pointed towards an officer named Ferdinand Esterhazy. Picquart compared the evidence. Esterhazy had access to the secrets mentioned in the original note, had communicated with the German military attaché, and had handwriting that closely resembled the document used to convict Dreyfus. The real spy appeared to be enjoying Paris, while an innocent man slowly disappeared on an island. Picquart brought the discovery to his superiors, expecting the army to reopen the case. The generals saw a different problem. If Dreyfus was innocent, then senior officers, investigators, judges, and the Ministry of War had all helped convict the wrong man. Correcting the injustice would also require admitting how badly the institution had failed. Picquart was told to stop. When he kept pushing, he was transferred to Tunisia and later imprisoned. The army had dealt with the crisis, although not the espionage crisis. It had dealt with the man who noticed it. An intelligence officer then produced additional evidence against Dreyfus. The new evidence was forged. By this point, the real spy was protected. The innocent man remained imprisoned. The officer who discovered the truth had been punished, and the people defending the original investigation were now manufacturing evidence to prove the investigation had been reliable. Institutional self-defense is one of the few machines that can run entirely on its own mistakes. In 1898, novelist Émile Zola published an open letter across the front page of a Paris newspaper under an enormous headline, J'accuse. He accused the military of framing Dreyfus and protecting the real spy. The government responded for prosecuting Zola for libel. He fled to England. France split into hostile camps. Families stopped speaking. Politicians fought and crowds rioted. Esterhazy was acquitted. When Dreyfus finally received another military trial in 1899, he was found guilty again, this time with extenuating circumstances. Apparently, the judges believed he had committed treason, but perhaps not in a particularly mean-spirited way. Dreyfus was pardoned soon afterwards, though he wasn't fully exonerated until 1906. The French army existed to defend France. For more than a decade, however, it treated defending its reputation as more important. The institution feared espionage, but it feared embarrassment even more. Chapter 2. The Doctor with Dirty News. In 1847, the Vienna General Hospital operated 2 maternity clinics. Doctors and medical students staffed the first. Midwives staffed the second. Women in the doctor's clinic died at roughly 3 times the rate. They arrived healthy, delivered healthy babies, developed fevers, then deteriorated rapidly. Their abdomens swelled, their organs failed, and many died within days. Pregnant women in Vienna knew about the difference. Some begged not to be admitted to the doctor's clinic. Ignaz Semmelweis was a young Hungarian physician working there, and the numbers haunted him. The 2 clinics were in the same hospital and served similar patients, yet one was dramatically more dangerous. Doctors proposed explanations involving bad air, overcrowding, emotional distress, religious rituals, and the position in which women gave birth. Medicine had theories for everything except the possibility that the medicine itself was the problem. Then one of Semmelweis's colleagues was accidentally cut with a scalpel during an autopsy. He developed a fever and died. Semmelweis recognized the same pattern of internal damage he'd seen in the women who died after childbirth. The doctors and students often performed autopsies in the morning. Afterwards, without disinfecting their hands, they walked upstairs and examined women in labor. They were carrying material from the corpses directly into the new patients' bodies. The doctors weren't merely failing to stop the disease, they were spreading it. Semmelweis ordered everyone entering the clinic to scrub with chlorinated lime. The solution smelled awful and irritated the skin, which gave doctors several compelling reasons to complain about a procedure that was preventing women from dying. The death rate collapsed. At one point, it fell from more than 18% to close to 1%. Semmelweis didn't yet understand bacteria because germ theory hadn't been established. He couldn't place the killer under a microscope and introduce it to the medical facility. What he could show was much simpler. When doctors cleaned their hands, women survived. The profession responded with resistance. Some physicians rejected his explanation because it contradicted established theory. Others resented the suggestion that educated gentlemen had been walking from corpses to maternity beds with contaminated hands. Accusing an entire profession of causing mass death, even when correct, rarely improves your position within that profession. Semmelweis grew furious. He wrote angry letters and accused doctors who rejected disinfection of participating in murder. His tone became increasingly hostile, which gave his critics something much more comfortable to discuss than all the dead women. His career collapsed. His mental health deteriorated, and in 1865, he was committed to an institution. He died weeks later at 47. Only afterwards did the medical establishment broadly accept the principle he'd fought to prove. Semmelweis had the evidence. His opponents had professional authority. Authority won the argument for a while, and the bacteria continued killing mothers. Chapter 3. The Scientist Who Starved to Stop a Famine. Nikolai Vavilov wanted to end hunger. He didn't plan to do it through a conference, a slogan, or a committee that would eventually recommend another conference with a new slogan. He wanted to find crops capable of surviving disease, drought, frost, and famine. Beginning in the 1920s, the Soviet botanist traveled through Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. He climbed mountains, crossed deserts, and visited isolated farms and village markets. He collected unusual varieties of wheat, barley, corn, potatoes, fruit, nuts, and seeds. Vavilov understood a basic vulnerability in modern agriculture. When farmers planted enormous fields of nearly identical crops, one disease could destroy everything. An obscure wild plant growing in a remote valley might carry the genetic trait needed to save an entire harvest. Vavilov collected wild apples in Central Asia, grains in Ethiopia, and potatoes in South America. Seeds that looked worthless might someday save millions of lives. His institute in Leningrad became one of the greatest collections of crop diversity ever assembled. It was a biological insurance policy for civilization. Then Vavilov encountered Trofim Lysenko. Lysenko claimed that crops could be transformed by changing their environment and that those acquired changes would be passed to future generations. The idea fit Soviet ideology perfectly. If people and societies could be remade through the revolutionary determination, perhaps wheat could be encouraged to improve its political attitude too. Genetics said inheritance followed biological rules. Lysenko said nature could be persuaded to cooperate. His theory had one tremendous advantage over Vavilov's. Stalin liked it. Lysenko rose quickly. His critics were accused of obstructing progress, and genetics was condemned as a bourgeois pseudoscience. Researchers learned that experimental results were much safer when they agreed with the government. Vavilov refused to play along. He publicly challenged Lysenko and continued defending genetics while colleagues lost their jobs or disappeared. In 1940, Soviet security agents arrested Vavilov while he was collecting plants in Ukraine. They accused him of sabotage, espionage, and conspiring against Soviet agriculture. The man who'd spent his life trying to prevent famine had become an enemy of the state because crops wouldn't obey the state's ideology. He was interrogated, sentenced to death, and eventually sent into the prison system. Then history produced one of its cruelest scenes. While Vavilov starved in captivity, Nazi forces surrounded Leningrad. Food disappeared. People ate pets, leather, glue, and wallpaper paste. Inside Vavilov's institute were rooms filled with rice, wheat, corn, beans, nuts, and potatoes. The scientists could have eaten the collection, but many of the samples were irreplaceable. Consuming them might save a handful of people for a few days. Preserving them might save entire populations in the future. Several scientists starved while guarding rooms full of food. Vavilov never returned. In January 1943, the scientist who had devoted his life to defeating famine died in prison from starvation and illness. The seed collection survived, and so did genetics. Lysenko's promises eventually collided with harvests that remained stubbornly uninterested in Soviet political theory. The government had made bad science patriotic and good science dangerous. Nature didn't care which one had Stalin's stamp of approval. Chapter 4. Put on your management hat. On January 27, 1986, engineers at Morton Thiokol joined a conference call with NASA. The Space Shuttle Challenger was scheduled to launch the next morning, but Florida was experiencing unusually cold weather. Icicles hung from the launch tower. The shuttle's solid rocket boosters were assembled in sections. Rubber seals called O-rings were supposed to close the joints between those sections when the rockets ignited. Those O-rings already had a troubling history. Previous launches had shown erosion and scorching. The coldest previous shuttle launch had occurred at 53 degrees, and that flight had shown concerning O-ring damage. The next morning would be colder than any previous shuttle launch. Cold rubber responds more slowly. A warm O-ring could expand quickly into place as the joint shifted under pressure. A cold one might remain compressed during the brief moment when burning gas could escape. That moment would last only a fraction of a second, which is still longer than anyone wants when sitting above millions of pounds of rocket fuel. The Thiokol engineers recommended postponing the launch. NASA managers pushed back and asked a question that sounded reasonable. At exactly what temperature would the O-ring fail? The engineers couldn't answer. They could show damage from cold flights and explain that the seal became less responsive as temperatures dropped. They could point out that the shuttle was moving far beyond its previous experience. What they couldn't do was provide the exact temperature at which concern would become catastrophe. NASA wanted proof that failure was certain. The engineers could only demonstrate that the risk was serious and poorly understood. Thiokol's managers asked for a private caucus, and the NASA line went silent. For roughly half an hour, the engineers and executives argued among themselves. Bob Lund, Thiokol's vice president of engineering, had supported the recommendations not to launch. Then senior executive Jerry Mason told him, take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. It's hard to imagine a sentence that captures the entire disaster more efficiently. The engineering hat asked whether the shuttle was safe. The management hat asked whether anyone could prove it would explode. Nothing about the weather, the rocket, or the O-rings had changed. Only the standard for making the decision had changed. Management reversed the recommendation, and the launch was approved. The engineers still objected, but their opposition vanished as the decision moved upward. Alan McDonald, Thiokol's senior representative at the launch site, refused to sign the approval. The burden of proof had quietly flipped. The shuttle no longer had to be shown as safe. The engineers had to prove it would fail. A deadline is only a date until the institution gives it voting rights. At 11:38 the next morning, Challenger rose into a clear blue sky. For a few moments, everything appeared normal. Cameras later revealed dark smoke escaping from a joint in the right solid rocket booster almost immediately after ignition. The cold O-rings hadn't sealed correctly. For a short time, debris blocked the leak. Then, about 58 seconds into the flight, a flame appeared. Hot gas cut into the external fuel tank. 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger broke apart, killing all 7 crew members. Millions watched it happen live, including my 5th grade class. We saw the shuttle rise and then watched branching trails spread across the sky. For several seconds, none of us understood what we were seeing. Our teacher did. She rushed to the television and switched it off with shaking hands. The Rogers Commission later concluded that the launch decision had been seriously flawed. Senior decision-makers hadn't received the full history of the O-ring problems. They hadn't seen Thiokol's original recommendation against launching below 53 degrees, and they didn't know that engineers still opposed the launch after management reversed them. NASA hadn't been defeated by an invisible threat nobody understood. The danger had been discussed on a conference call the night before. Burning gas destroyed the shuttle. The decision had been compromised earlier when uncertainty became permission. Chapter 5. Speak Up. Nearly 4 decades later, Boeing quality engineer Sam Salepour appeared before the United States Senate. His history had an eerie connection to Challenger. Early in his aerospace career, Salepour regularly commuted with an engineer who described his concerns about the shuttle's O-rings and his failed attempt to get management to listen. After Challenger, Salepour made himself a promise. If he ever found himself in that position, he'd speak up. By 2024, he believed that moment had arrived. Salepour had worked in aerospace for almost 40 years and at Boeing for 17. He testified that the company's production culture had often prioritized speed over safety and quality. He raised concerns about gaps between major sections of the 787 fuselage and the amount of force used to pull those sections together. After moving to the 777 program, he said he witnessed misaligned components being forced into place with cranes and heavy equipment. In one instance, he said workers jumped on pieces of an airplane to make them align. That's a familiar technique for closing an overpacked suitcase. It's less comforting when the suitcase will soon be carrying 300 people at 35,000 feet. Salepour said that after raising concerns, he was transferred, excluded from meetings, sidelined, and threatened. During one design review, he asked senior leaders how Boeing planned to improve its construction process. His supervisor later told him that another manager had complained. The issue wasn't simply that Salepour had raised the concern. He'd raised it in front of potential customers. The truth had become visible to people who might actually do something inconvenient with it. Boeing disputed Salepour's technical conclusions and defended the safety of its aircraft. The company pointed to extensive testing and inspections programs and announced additional training, manufacturing controls, and improvements to its confidential reporting system. That reporting system was called Speak Up. Then a door left an airplane over Portland. The missing bolts weren't an opinion or an allegation. They were physical evidence. Boeing had procedures, forms, audits, quality departments, and employee reporting channels. It possessed every visible accessory of institutional vigilance. It just didn't have the bolts. Modern organizations have become extremely good at building official channels for bad news, but they haven't become very good at protecting the people who use them. Conclusion, the final warning. None of these institutions openly declared a war on truth. The French army didn't announce that it preferred a false conviction. Vienna's doctors didn't support preventable death. The Soviet government didn't officially request failed harvests, and NASA didn't intend to kill 7 astronauts. Boeing certainly didn't plan to deliver an airplane with 4 critical bolts missing. The failure began more quietly. An institution developed a flattering story about itself. We're honorable, we're scientific, we represent progress, we employ the finest experts in the world. Then someone delivers information that threatens the story. And at that point, leaders could correct the problem or attack the person who made the problem impossible to ignore. Dangerous institutions usually choose the second option. They call caution obstruction, dissent negativity, and accuracy disloyalty. They spend more energy investigating the tone of the warning than the danger being described. The truth teller had embarrassed the hierarchy before the hierarchy had been ready with a statement. Humans say they want honesty, but we generally prefer it after management has approved it, legal has reviewed it, communications has softened it, and everyone responsible has retired. Physical reality doesn't care about any of that. Bacteria didn't care that the doctors found hand washing insulting. Crops didn't improve because Stalin preferred Lysenko. Rubber didn't become flexible because NASA had a launch schedule, and missing bolts didn't appear because Boeing had a quality department. Reality is the only person in the meeting that can't be intimidated. Of course, whistleblowers aren't always right. Dissidents aren't automatically heroic, and some employees really are exhausting. But an organization that punishes uncomfortable information eventually loses the ability to distinguish a crank from a prophet until after the explosion. That's when everyone remembers the memo. This danger is more urgent now because modern institutions can distribute reassurance faster than ever. Governments, corporations, and political movements can broadcast confidence to millions before one engineer can get a meeting with higher-ups. Truth becomes treason when an institution's story about itself becomes more valuable than the people it exists to serve. Every catastrophe has a final moment when it becomes unavoidable, but before that, there's usually a smaller moment when someone notices a strange pattern, a damaged seal, a falsified document, a manufacturing defect, or a missing bolt. Somebody says something is wrong. And what happens next may depend on whether the people in charge fear the danger or the person who noticed it. Hey, thanks for watching my video. Please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to see when I make more. I make these videos totally for free, and your support really helps the channel grow. You can also share this with someone you think will like it, check out the Amazon links to cool stuff in the description, and tip me if you feel so inclined. Venmo at History of Human Nature. I appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.